right, Saints, welcome to Bible study. We didn't meet last week because that was Holy Week. So we're going to pick up our work on the story of Noah that was in part inspired by the church's viewing of the film. So what I'll do tonight is I'll work a little bit more on the narrative, and then next week Pastor Wesley will pick up some of those theological questions that I will continue to artfully dodge until next week. But since we've missed a week, I want to just do a little bit of review for those of you who may not have been here last time. So when we talk about the story of Noah, we're talking about a story that appears in the first 11 chapters of Genesis. And does anyone remember what we call the first 11 chapters of Genesis? I heard. Prehistory, primeval, or primordial history. Prehistory. So it's in these first 11 chapters that we get these stories that concern the entire world. We get the story of creation, the story of the beginning of humanity. And these stories not only tell us how things came to be, but why things are the way they are. So we have at least two things working here. In Genesis chapters 1 and 2, we have stories about creation and the way God makes the world. And some of the things we want to take away from that is that God orders the world or creates the world and makes order. And part of that work involves establishing limits. There are limits to the world. The sea can't go anywhere it wants to. All right? The birds have a domain. The fish have a domain. Land animals have a domain. Human beings have a domain. And we move further into Genesis chapter 2 and realize not only that human beings have a domain, but human beings as a part of the created order also have limits. You can eat of anything in the garden except. And when Adam and Eve cross that boundary, then we see that causes separation between humanity and God. After Adam and Eve take of the fruit that they were not supposed to take, the rest of the primeval history in some ways shows us this pattern of increased separation from God. So on one hand, we have this kind of unfolding, if you will, of human development because we have families and family lines that develop. And if someone has more than one child, now we have 2 or 3 lines that we're trying to keep track of. So we have genealogies interspersed with the narratives or the stories in the first 11 chapters. But as we read those, we see this increased separation. People are further removed from God, and if we are further removed from God, we're further removed from each other, and we're further removed from the created world. And so all of these things are unfolding so that we get to the place where the flood begins in Genesis chapter 6. Now, just before I go any further, just to get to the flood, when I talk about this pattern of increased separation or families separating out, it works on 2 levels. In one way, separation is inevitable. So if you have 6 children, you're going to have 6 family lines, and those family lines are going to expand and spread out. So there's something about this that's natural development. But it's also the case that as that natural development happens, that we see a pattern of what I call othering. So that when the stories of lines are told, you can tell who Israel likes and who Israel doesn't. So that we start to talk about the beginning of these people, but the story of that ancestor doesn't look so good. So that the characters that we see as we begin the genealogies are not just individuals. They are individuals, but they also come to represent a people. Does that make sense? So an easy example would be the story of Jacob and Esau. So we all know, most of us know this story. Isaac has twins. Their names are Jacob and Esau. And if you remember the story, Esau is not presented in the best light. He's presented as impulsive. He gives away his birthright for a bowl of beans. I mean, maybe they were good, but come on, man. Like, who would do that? So he makes these kind of impetuous decisions. Well, part of what we want to know is Esau is an individual, but he also, in the narrative, represents the Edomites. And by the time we get this story written down, the Israelites and the Edomites are like this. So when I'm talking about the ancestor of someone I don't like, how does that have an impact on how they are portrayed? Okay? So we'll come back to that in just a bit, but that has to do with that increased separation. When we get to Genesis chapter 6, I want to look a little bit just at the beginning of the story, but for the most part tonight, I want to focus our attention for what happens after the flood, after the ark gets back on dry land. Look in Genesis chapter 6, verse 9. Begins with the genealogy. These are the descendants of Noah. Noah was a righteous man, blameless in his generation. Noah walked with God, and Noah had 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Now the earth was corrupt in God's sight, and the earth was filled with violence. And God saw that the earth was corrupt, for all flesh had corrupted its way upon the earth. So here we have the reason for the flood. And what is this? That the earth was corrupt and filled with lawlessness. Some translations might say violence. The earth was filled with violence. I was reading the New Revised Standard Version. What does your translation say? Oh, you're just pulling up from your 900 translations. Okay. So when it says that the earth is filled with lawlessness or violence, it suggests that the violence or the lawlessness is a result of something else. So the earth is filled with lawlessness because of something that's going on. And so some scholars like to think that essentially what this text is saying is that the people had become affluent. And because of their affluence and because of their excess, they had started mistreating the earth and one another, another way of increased separation from God. And think about how we often see a pattern of affluence and excess leading to that kind of behavior. So with sin in the world, if God creates the world by establishing order, sin reintroduces the chaos that existed before the world began. So with each successive sin or act that we see, so taking of the fruit, Cain killing his brother Abel, and you see all of these things happening, you can get this sense that there is chaos that's leaking in. All right? I love this image because often in our lives, when we do something and we know it's wrong and, lightning doesn't strike us, we're like, oh, cool, okay. But what we don't think about is that we're making these little holes, these little dents in our lives so that by the time we look up, we're filled with stuff and we don't know where it came from. So what you have in this narrative is this progression, and by the time you get to chapter 6, the earth is filled. All right, so it's not like everybody woke up one day and said, all right, let's all break bad. But it might have been a process of continued disobedience. And that's why it is good to have forgiveness. And it is good to know that God can heal us, but it is so much easier not to get in that place. Because we waste a lot of time cleaning up mess that we didn't always have to make. Some things we can't avoid. But we all know there's some things we created all on our own. Okay. So when we think about the flood, I want you then to think about the flood taking us back to the beginning of the world before creation, and we'll go back to that time of chaos. That means that the flood presents us with the opportunity for God to do the work of creation again. So part of what we want to think about in the act of creation is that creation, or the act of creation, is renewed whenever chaos is subdued. All right, that God constantly reestablishes order. The flood, is literally the watery chaos that exists. But water in the ancient world often represents chaos because of this kind of, before creation, this primordial water that represents chaos. The flood then is another way of thinking about this chaos. Water is also, though, associated with birth. So with this image, we have the potential for destruction and new life. And I'll go back to the ark and think about the ark as the container for new life. And it's almost like the image of a womb, okay? Carrying the life that will then start again on dry land. And I think I mentioned a couple of weeks ago, if we look at the ark, that word is the same word that's used to talk about the basket that Moses' mother put him in. And if you look at that story, in the story of Exodus, with the water, the children were supposed to be thrown in the Nile. That's chaos, that's death. But here you have an ark that preserves the life of the one who will bring people to new life, new identity. And how do they get there? By crossing the Dead Sea. So you get that sense of water for both chaos and new life. And it is tied to the act of baptism. So when we are baptized, this is why immersion is so nice, because we go down into this, we die, we come back new. All right? So it is both death and life, and all of that gets tied in with this water imagery that we have in the flood. So now I want to shift to the end of the story and just focus on a couple of themes. When we talk about biblical narrative, we always talk about the fact that the story has gaps. It doesn't tell us everything. What were the names of Noah's sons' wives? We don't know. Where did Cain's wife come from? If I know, I will tell you. So it does not tell us all of these things, but sometimes we get distracted by what it doesn't tell us, away from what it does tell us. So there are things in this story that are of importance. What are they and why? And so what I'd like to do is look at the end of this story and focus on a couple of things. I want to focus on sacrifice, promise, and covenant. Okay. Now, before we move into this, are there questions about anything that I said before that? We're good? Okay. Before the flood begins, Noah has to take animals into the ark. Genesis 6:19, he is told, "And of every living thing of all flesh you shall bring 2 of every kind into the ark to keep them alive with you. They shall be male and female, of the birds according to their kind, and of the animals according to their kinds, of every creeping thing of the ground according to its kind. 2 of every kind shall come into you to keep them alive. Also take with you every kind of food that is eaten, and store it up, and it shall serve as food for you and for them." Noah did this. He did all that God commanded him. So this is where we get the image that is in children's books, animals 2 by 2 going into the ark, a pair of everything. Now look in chapter 7, verses 1 and 2. The Lord said to Noah, "Go into the ark, you and all your household, for I have seen that you alone are righteous before me in this generation. Take with you 7 pairs of all clean animals, the male and its mate, and a pair of the animals that are not clean, the male and its mate, and 7 pairs of the birds of the air, also male and female, to keep their kind alive on the face of all the earth. For in 7 days I will bring rain upon the earth for 40 days and 40 nights, and every living thing that I have made I will blot out from the face of the earth." And Noah did all that the Lord had commanded him. So here we see For one, the representation of two different traditions. In one, we have 2 animals, and in the other, we have 7 pairs of clean animals, and then 1 pair of unclean animals. And why do we need more clean animals? So, what did you say? For food. He said for food. Yes. So, we talk about clean animals for sacrifice. Now, my question is, where in the first 6 chapters of Genesis do we have anything about sacrifice of animals? Okay, so when Adam and Eve come out of the garden, God kills an animal so that they can have clothes. Is that a sacrifice, or is that God killing an animal? Why is it a sacrifice?
Because he's using it for covering.
Oh, okay. All right, hold on to that. That's a theological answer, but I'm not mad at you. That's a good answer. Hold on to that. Someone said, so in the story of Cain and Abel make sacrifice. And Cain offers something from the ground, some produce of some kind, and Abel offers, okay? And so I'm going to ask the question again. So we have this story of sacrifice. This is clearly a sacrifice. This is almost always interpreted as a sacrifice or as something that prefigures sacrifice, okay? Because this whole notion of covering, okay? Where in the story of Cain and Abel do we get any information about the animals being clean or unclean? We don't. The point I'm trying to make is the introduction of clean and unclean animals comes in this story. So where did that come from? Who said God? Okay. Well, we all just go home now. That's the answer to everything. Came from God. Yes.
Maybe from what you were saying a couple of weeks ago about like the authors who wrote the story later. So it's like the priestly writer, I think you call it.
Yeah, right. So the question is, yes, is this what the world of the writers or the knowledge of the writers informing? They understood, maybe God said, take these animals, take 7 pairs of these, and the priestly writer's like, yes, those are the clean animals. We get legislation about clean and unclean animals much later, all right? So the point I want to make is that there is clearly an understanding of sacrifice when the story is written. But I want you to think about how the concept of sacrifice develops and grows. When we say that God's killing of the animal to cover Adam and Eve is a sacrifice, we do that because we have a developed sense of sacrifice. On a very simple level, God killed the animal to get the fur, right? But we have an understanding of sacrifice as covering and atoning that we then read into that story. That's not a bad reading by any sense or by any stretch of the imagination. Are you all with me on this so far? But just understand that sometimes we have a lens through which we read something. Now, hold on to that, because I just want to talk to you for a few minutes about sacrifice, okay? So, sacrifice is something that is not unique to Israel. So in the ancient world, everybody sacrificed. Everybody sacrificed to the gods that they believed in. And so Israel develops as a people, as a culture, as a religion, as a people who are called by God in a world where the God they serve is not the only God in town. And where their religious practices, they're not the only people who are praying, they're not the only people who are sacrificing. Part of what Israel does as it tells its story is constantly and intentionally try to distinguish themselves from everybody else. Everybody else sacrifices, but this is why we do it. Everybody else sacrifices, but we only sacrifice clean animals. Because our God says that some animals are appropriate for sacrifice and some are not. And so part of what we're getting here is this culture trying to set themselves apart because God has called them to be set apart. Are you with me so far? Questions before I go any further? Okay. In the ancient world, sacrifice to gods was done to feed them. Because the belief was, whatever we need, that would be what supernatural beings need. This is why some people would leave food in the tombs or caskets of the people who had departed. Because the thinking was, well, we eat, I'm going to want to eat over there too. So if I like eating here, I'm going to feed Grandpa and get him some food, and so the deceased would be fed, that the gods would be fed. All right, that was the mindset. All right? It's not only the case that they believed that the gods were fed, but in some creation myths, the reason for creation, in some stories, the whole purpose of humanity was to feed the gods. Okay? Now, contrast that with what we have in Genesis 1. We are made in God's image and after God's likeness. And when we read that, that is standing over and against a view of you were just here to provide food for the gods. All right? The God who created us not only creates us in God's image and God's likeness, but gives us will so that we can choose whether or not to be obedient or disobedient. And even when we are disobedient, God still finds a way to be in relationship with us. So the God of Israel did not create us so that we can offer sacrifices to feed God. How do we know this? Turn to the book of Psalms, chapter 50. Psalm 50, verse 12. If I were hungry, I would not tell you, for the world and all that is in it is mine. Do I eat the flesh of bulls or drink the blood of goats? Offer to God a sacrifice of thanksgiving and pay your vows to the Most High. So here we have God saying, don't get this confused. If I'm hungry, I'm going to get my own food. I do not need you for that. That's not why God is asking God's people to sacrifice. God is asking for sacrifice of thanksgiving. So we want to be clear that for all of the sacrifices that we have that are outlined in the book of Leviticus and whatever purposes they serve, God does not need them to eat. Okay? They serve another purpose. And so part of what we want to be clear on in this story is how the sacrifice piece is setting itself, the practice, over and against what other people would have done. Are we doing okay? Okay. Usually a sacrifice would involve animals and it would involve burning them. Okay? Because again, if the gods were hungry, that was like ringing the dinner bell. Okay? So the gods would smell the food and know that it was time to eat. In the Bible, God likes the smell because it is pleasing to God, but not because God needs the food. So now look at what happens in Genesis when Noah offers a sacrifice. So let's go back to Genesis chapter 8. Genesis 8:20, then Noah built an altar to the Lord and took of every clean bird and offered burnt offerings, clean animal, and of every clean bird and offered burnt offerings on the altar. And when the Lord smelled the pleasing odor, the Lord said in his heart, I will never again curse the ground because of humankind, for the inclination of the human heart is evil from its youth, nor will I ever again destroy every living creature as I have done. As long as the earth endures, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night shall not cease. Why does Noah offer a sacrifice? Anybody want to guess? A Thanksgiving, okay? Okay. So it could be an act of thanksgiving. It could be an act of homage. We have this word for burnt offering that's used here, and it literally is olah, which means going up. Olah. The sense of sending something up to God. The reason this matters is because the more we learn about sacrifice, the more we learn about what it is that God wants of us. So, if you go to the beginning of the book of Leviticus, you will spend a long time reading lots of verses that give you lots of instructions about sacrifice. And most of us, because we're Christians, say, oh, we don't need this anymore because Jesus was the ultimate sacrifice. Close the book, let's move on. But if you spend time understanding the nature of sacrifice, you have to ask yourself, why is God asking them to go through all of these machinations and changes and requirements for this sacrifice? God doesn't need it to eat, so why do we have to do all this? And I understand that we sacrifice for a covering for our sins, but why does it have to be this way? Why does it have to be this animal? Why does it have to be laid out this way? Why do we have to do it all? Why is there all of this attention given to the details around how a sacrifice is offered? Anybody want to guess? Because I'm looking for some good answers. Yes?
When you read Leviticus, you're also talking about disciplining a society, too, of the rules and the certain things. And if you start looking at the types of animals that they're sacrificing, what they term unclean, and you think about the diseases you could get at the time, it begins to make sense if you're trying to order a society and put discipline and rules from a hierarchical perspective. They're coming from slaves out of Egypt where they just did whatever they did.
Okay, so it's a way of learning about discipline and to organize a society, and that these people were coming out of Egypt and would not have known those things. And you just made me remember my rule. You've got to come to the microphone so that I don't get emails from people who couldn't hear what you said. And somebody else had their hand up, and now they don't want to talk because they've got to come to the mic. Come to the mic. Come to the mic. Yes, thank God you can walk. You're welcome.
I read a commentary once about what did people have to do before Jesus. What was the basis of salvation before Jesus? And one of the things that I read was that a lot of the things that God put into place pointed to Jesus. In other words, even sacrifices were pointing along the ages to what God was ultimately going to give us in his Son.
Okay.
And so my understanding of, I'm kind of getting off the subject here, but my understanding of what people had to do in order to be saved was to believe in God's provision for them before Jesus came. So in terms of the sacrifice, I think it was pointing toward Jesus.
So it points towards Jesus. Okay. Anybody else? Can you meet me halfway? What do you think?
I was just going to say to show your obedience to him.
Ah, okay. I think that's a good answer. They're all good answers, but let me tell you why I want to stress that. Because For all the ways in which sacrifice makes sense in terms of ordering a society, there are some things about sacrifice that do not make sense. So that there are things God asks in the act of sacrifice, even when we consider those original contexts, that do not make sense. Why? Why do we have to do all of that? Real seriously. Why does it have to be in this place and not that place? Why do you have to cut it here and not there? Why? And so I want to suggest that a huge part of sacrifice is not about the details, and it's about being obedient. And the question that it raises for me is, are you willing to follow God when it does not make sense to you personally? Sacrifice is requiring you to come out of yourself in some way, shape, or form. And there are going to be moments in your life where whatever the sacrifice is, whether it is fasting, whether it is keeping your mouth shut, whether it is praising God, whatever this thing is that God is asking of you will not make sense. And so that's where that point of discipline comes in. Are you going to do it because God asked you to? And the reality is, most of us are pretty good at doing the things God asks us to do that make sense. And we have this way of talking about it. So we will talk about, well, you know, these animals weren't good for them, so that was a good thing. Well, sometimes some of those animals would not have been a problem. Why are they on the list? Because God said so. Because God wants to see, are you going to follow when it doesn't work for you? Are you going to follow when it's not convenient for you culturally? Because ultimately, what God wants is us. All right? God doesn't need us to feed him, but God wants us to want him. So much so that we will do what is asked. And this is a really important point because there are some parts of this relationship with God that are more about passion and less about logic. Okay? I want some of you to remember when you were younger and in love. And you would go places or drive for hours to see somebody. And if you had to drive to see that same person today, you might say to yourself, well, you know, I'd rather watch a movie, or maybe, but what does it mean when in the beginning of our relationship with God, we are so passionate, we are so glad to be saved, we witness to so many people, nobody wants to sit next to us, right? You all know what new Christians are like, right? Jesus, 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 Jesus all day long. And then after we get to thinking about it and living it for a while, the passion fades. And we start deciding when we're going to listen to God, when it fits in, when it makes sense, and we're missing what sacrifice was all about. It is about coming up out of yourself. It is about doing what makes no sense whatsoever because of who asked me to do it. And so when we think about this whole concept of sacrifice, I want you to think, here in this trajectory we have in the first 11 chapters, we have movement away from God, movement away from God, movement away from each other, movement away from the earth, and sacrifice. So in the midst of this big movement, all right, we still don't know the names of Noah's sons' wives, but we know that Noah offers a sacrifice, and the story takes the time to mention it because it's important. It's talking about how we will be able to connect with God even as the history of humanity seems to be moving away. Even as it seems like the trajectory is moving away, we have these things in the story that are showing us the way back to God by sacrifice. And just because Jesus paid the ultimate sacrifice, thank you, Lord, yes, he is risen, that does not mean that we no longer have to think about being sacrificial Christians. Okay? And you can think about the ways we all know what hurts us. For some of us, it's the pocketbook. For some of us, it is time. But whatever it is, there are going to be things that God asks of you, and it has nothing to do with what makes sense. It has to do with whether or not you were in this thing or not. Okay? So that's sacrifice. It is this voluntary act we do. After the sacrifice, then we have God making a promise. The Lord said in his heart, I will never again curse the ground because of humankind. For the inclination of the human heart, I love this, here we go again, is evil from its youth, nor will I ever again destroy every living creature as I have done. What do we have here where we have, what comes to mind when you hear, I will never again curse the ground? We've seen this before. So when Adam and Eve disobey, God curses the ground. So now let's think about this. We have creation, we have Adam and Eve disobeying, we've got this kind of stretch of moving further away from God, the earth gets filled with violence, here comes the flood. But this second creation or recreation or reordering is not the same as the first. God doesn't start from scratch. God takes from what exists and preserves it into this new environment. And we can see that things haven't changed a whole lot because we're going to read in a few verses and we're going to get in a mess already. So the second time around is a little different. There is an acknowledgement that we are not going to get it right. That's why we need sacrifice. Because now we know what's going to happen. But here, just as in the very beginning, God creates by setting limits and establishing order, which I did not write down. Here, God establishes limits in this promise by saying, I will never again curse the ground. I will never again destroy every living creature. So here, a different kind of limit where God will limit God's self in what he will do in this created world. Chapter 9, God blessed Noah and his sons and said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. The fear and dread of you shall rest on every animal of the earth and on every bird of the air, on everything that creeps on the ground, and on all the fish of the sea. Into your hand they are delivered. Every moving thing that lives shall be food for you. And just as I gave you the green plants, I give you everything. Only you shall not eat flesh with its life, that is its blood. For your own lifeblood I will surely require a reckoning. From every animal I will require it, and from human beings, each one for the blood of another, I will require a reckoning for human life. Whoever sheds the blood of a human, by a human shall that person's blood be shed. For in his own image God made humankind. And you be fruitful and multiply, abound on the earth, and multiply in it. So this is lovely because in this section we have a picking up of themes that we had in the creation story, right? God says be fruitful and multiply. That's what happened in Genesis 1, be fruitful and multiply. And here, replenish the earth, right? So refill, fill it up again, replenish the earth, fill the earth. Now, what's different after that? What's different in the world after the flood? Okay, and yes, now we've got, you can not just eat the green things, you can eat meat. Okay? What else is different?
He also gives them a limit with regards to, he says what will happen if they kill another man.
So we've got some legislation around taking another life. We have permission to eat meat. Go even further before all of that. What happens in verse 2?
The animals and everything will be afraid of
The animals will be afraid of humans. So this raises the question, so were they not afraid of them in the beginning, which also helps us understand how the animals got on the ark. So this is, well, it's good to know. So this might be a shift then, so that this second restoration or establishing of order is still not what we started with. The sense then that because of that disobedience that happened in Genesis chapter 3, things are moving away. But all the while they're moving away, God is adjusting for us. God says sacrifice is going to be the way that we reconnect. All right? And now, since y'all don't know how to act, we need to have some rules so that you know you can't kill each other. All right? So that here we have this law then that says the shedding of blood. So in the ancient world, life is in the blood. All right? Which is why you would not eat an animal's blood. That would be like eating its life force. And that's why you don't shed the blood of another human being, because then you would be taking away their life force. So this sense then of respect of life. Okay, so the animals are going to be afraid. If you're going to eat meat, don't do it with its blood, and then you will not take the blood of another. Why? Because in verse 6 it says, "For in his own image God made humankind." There is still something about us that reflects God, even in this broken world, that requires us to respect one another's gift of life. All right? I have always said it's the challenge of living in community is being able to see the image of God in somebody else. Like, think about the person who gets on your nerves the most and give yourself the challenge of what in them, and don't say they don't have anything in them because they're the exception to the rule. I know they've got nothing of God in them. No, but ask yourself or ask God to show you what is in them that is a reflection of God's image, so that you can begin to see that and begin to redeem in your own eyes that person. Maybe come to understand them a little bit better. Okay, now, verse 8. So we move from sacrifice to promise, and then we come to covenant. Okay, this is the first covenant in the Bible. So we have a number of covenants. We have the covenant with Noah. We've got a covenant with David. We've got covenants as they come, but this is the first one. So I want us to just take a moment to see what goes on here, because God says, "As for me, I am establishing my covenant with you." One second. Okay, "I am establishing or placing my covenant with you and your descendants after you, and with every living creature that is with you, the birds, the domestic animals, and every animal of the earth with you, as many as came out of the ark. I establish my covenant with you, that never again shall all flesh be cut off by the waters of a flood, and never again shall there be a flood to destroy the earth." So can someone tell me what a covenant is? A bond, an agreement. We like to use the term contract. That's a really nice thing, because a contract usually involves at least two parties, and that means that there's an agreement that party A agrees to the following and party B agrees to the following, and then they, write it out, and there's some witnesses and, some kind of ceremony to make it official. When we get to the book of Exodus and we have covenants, we will see all of those elements where God enacts a covenant and God has a job and the people have a job and there are witnesses and there's animal sacrifice, and it's this full-blown covenant in the way that it's supposed to be. This covenant is interesting because God says, "I will establish my covenant, that never again shall flesh be cut off by the waters of a flood, never again shall there be a flood to destroy the earth." So God makes a covenant with the created world. And what is God's job in the covenant? God says, "For my part, I will not destroy the earth." What is the people's part? They don't have one. So here's the first covenant is a strange covenant, because it doesn't follow the rules of a covenant. It says, this is what I'm going to do, And essentially, it looks like all they got to do is just breathe. Okay? So here, this is important because it tells us something about the nature of covenant. So when you get to the book of Exodus and God says, this is what I'm going to do and this is what you're going to do, and the people say, yes, yes, we will do it, and they've got the blood and the sacrifice and all that stuff, and it's all official, what happens? The people don't keep their side of the covenant. And what does God do? God says, y'all broke the covenant. All right? God doesn't like that. But sooner or later, God comes back and says, okay, here's a new covenant. Let's try it this way. And then God says, this is what I'm going to do. And the people say, okay, that's good. And we get the whole ceremony. And what happens? The people don't do it. All right? And so God gets upset again. Y'all, we had an agreement, right? And what happens? God says, I'll make a new covenant. God keeps making the covenant work. The covenant doesn't work because of us. So God makes covenants with people who are incapable of keeping their end of the deal. Right? We do this all the time with our children. We come up with all these little contracts, right? I'm going to do this, you're going to do that. 4 days later. So we sit down and we have a meeting, right? But chances are you will not put them out. Chances are. I'm saying not always, right? Because what's going on here is the development of a relationship. And we are teaching them how to become responsible people. This is not a license to sin, because anybody who's lived long enough knows there are consequences for sin. Even though God forgives you, you've got to carry whatever comes with that. But the good news is that the first covenant shows us something about the character of God that understands that we are not always going to be up to the job. And built into that first covenant is somehow an understanding that the love of God is going to continue to pursue us, which is why the incarnation of Jesus Christ is so important. Because if we had been able to keep the first covenant, Jesus wouldn't have had to come. If we kept the second or even the 47th covenant, God would not have had to do what God did. And so it is for us this understanding that from the very beginning, God is willing to go to great lengths to be in relationship with us. This is not the God that the other people in the ancient Near East worship. Okay? This is not a God who says, feed me or else. This is a God who says, I want to be in relationship with you. I want you to love me so much that you will act the fool for me. And I, in turn, will keep running after you, crazy though you may be, because that is the nature of relationship. So for all the things that the story doesn't show us, don't forget the presence of sacrifice, God's promise, and God's covenant. Because it tells us something about the nature of God, that God wants to be in relationship with us. And we call this the Noahide covenant, surprise, surprise. And some people will talk about covenant as something that develops, but I don't like to think of it that way. I like to think of this first covenant as somehow symbolic of God's willingness to be in relationship with us. Okay? All right, we've got 6 minutes, and I'm finished talking. So if there are any questions, I'm happy to take them. If you come to the mic. And just pass it over.
I just didn't get the promise.
The promise is
Yes.
right after the sacrifice in chapter, now that you could have, I would have answered, you didn't have to get up for all that. All right, so it's in chapter 8, verse 21. After the Lord smells the pleasing odor, he promises that he won't do it again. Okay? Any other questions? Come on. You want to pass that in?
Is there any significance to the rainbow?
Yes. It's a good question. Okay, so it says God puts a bow in the clouds as God's sign and as a reminder. So I love this language because it says, let's see, where is it? When the bow is in the clouds, I will see it and remember the everlasting covenant between God and every living creature of all flesh that is on the earth. Who's talking? God. God says, it's a reminder to me. It's very interesting language because the bow, the rainbow, is considered a warrior's bow, like a bow and arrow. It's a sign of strength. So for people who worshiped Baal, for example, so Baal would have been a rain god, and Baal would have literally had his chariot run across the clouds, and that would make it rain. And after the thunderstorm, you'd see the rainbow, and that was like Baal saying, yeah, that was me, right? You know, look at my strength, people, see who I am. The God of Israel says, the bow is a sign of my restraint. It's a sign that I will not destroy the earth. So God's strength is in God's ability to hold back. And that language is just so interesting because the sense of God reminding God's self, oh, like God needs to remind God's self. It's really a reminder to us. Okay, it's a good question. Anything else? Come on.
More than a question, I just find it interesting that the covenant isn't just between God and man, but between God and all living creatures.
Yes.
You know, so maybe that's another reason why, you know, it's not like, well, what are you guys going to do? And then the animals have to suffer as a result of us not keeping our part of the covenant.
No, that's a really good point because if you think about Genesis 1, there is this, and in the creation story, there is this sense of humans as a part of the created order, and that sense of being all of us in right relationship with one another as a part of the created order. In the post-flood world, you have people eating animals. The animals definitely feel a shift, right? But now you see that this sense of God making a promise with all creation, that again, it seems to me this attempt to kind of remedy or preserve, hold on to this sense that all of us are part of God's creation. All right, so that it's not necessarily licensed, come on up to the mic, not necessarily licensed to abuse the created order. So there's a balance or a check against that in Genesis 1 and 2, and it seems to me that might be what that passage is doing as well.
I don't know if mine is a question or a comment, but I was intrigued by your introduction on the whole notion of boundaries. And I'd like to know, is that connected to when Jesus said on the cross, or before the cross, if I be lifted up, then I'll draw all men to me? Is he narrowing that boundary? I mean, we were falling away from him, and then he's bringing us back to him.
Sure, yeah, I mean, I think you could say that. Yeah. Yeah. That works. Okay. Anything else before we go? All right, beloved, next week, I think we'll probably wrap up with Noah next week, and then we will shift into something else, all right?